Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Claiming Our Seat at the Table, Women Organizers and Voting Rights. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you all know how to participate in today's event. This program will be recorded. Given this is a webinar, all audience members' cameras and microphones will be off. The recording will be made available on our website within 72 hours of today's program. Nonetheless, as an audience, you have access to drop questions in the Q&A tab, and you have the option to submit questions anonymously. Due to time constraints, please keep all questions on topic. Today's agenda, bio, and contact information will be shared in the chat throughout the program. If you experience any technical difficulties today, please explain your problem through the chat feature, and we will try our best to address the issue. Lastly, please follow the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights on Facebook and Twitter at Civil Rights NJ for the latest information on news, resources, and information from our office. I now turn it over to the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights Director of Outreach and Community Relations, T. Leonardo Santiago.
Thanks, Patricia. And thank you to the audience today for joining us. Whether born a woman or coming to live life as your authentic self, those of us who identify as women are an indispensable part of society. We are contributors, pioneers, and leaders in the arts, medicine, technology, engineering, mathematics, business, education, international policies, and countless other fields. We are trailblazers, activists, and champions of disrupting systems that are set up against us. We continue to redefine who we are and challenge stereotypes while claiming our seat at the table, and at times even building a whole new table to create space for others. With every victory, whether small or large, empowering us along the way and propping the door open for the next generation. The women's suffrage movement was a decades-long fight to win the right to vote for women in the United States. It took activists and reformers nearly 100 years to win that right. Over the decades, we have fought to obtain protections in employment, housing, place of public accommodation, as well as the right over our own bodies, a fight that we continue today. And while we could spend hours, if not days, digging deeper into the role that women have played in the social movements of equality and civil rights, today we will highlight and uplift the role women have played in activism, focusing on the fights for voting rights in New Jersey. Without further ado, I turn today's program over to our moderator, Community Relations Specialist, Kai Durant. Thank you.
Thank you, T. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As we said, our program is Claiming Our Seat at the Table, Women's Organizers and Voting Rights. For our discussion today, we have a couple panelists who will share their expertise in the area, and then we will come together as a group to have a panel discussions followed by questions and answers. So our first speaker today is Olivia Errico. Olivia is the Public Program Manager at the Alice Paul Institute. She has a background and studied in public history and liberal arts, and she has a focus and expertise in 20th century women's political movements, focusing on grassroots activism and the feminist movement. Thank you, Olivia, for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to you for your presentation.
All right. Thanks, Kai, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. So hi again, everyone. Like Kai said, my name is Olivia Errico. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Alice Paul Institute. The Alice Paul Institute is a National Historic Landmark in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and we are the birthplace of Alice Paul, who was a suffragist and organized to get women the right to vote. Today, API is dedicated to building an intergenerational movement for gender justice. And you can see Paulsdale, which is Alice Paul's birthplace, and where we are housed today on the screen here. So today, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the history of the women's suffrage movement. And to start my presentation, I wanted to share this quote from Sally Roche Wagner's 2019 anthology called The Women's Suffrage Movement. So in that anthology, she says, movements don't have a beginning or end. They are dams historians build in the river of history to capture the flow of a particular moment. And I wanted to start by sharing that because what Wagner is saying here is that the moment in history that we call the women's suffrage movement, which we generally use to refer to the period between 1848 and 1920, is just part of the full story of the movement for women's right to vote. Because we know that the fight didn't end in 1920 and still continues to this day. So histories of the women's suffrage movement usually start in 1848 because that was the year of the first Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. This convention was organized by early suffragists Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Mary Ann McClintock, Jane Hunt, and Martha Wright. So these women all had a background in the movement to abolish slavery, the abolitionist movement, and because of their experience working in the abolitionist movement, they gained a lot of skills that they were able to bring over to the fight for women's rights. So they learned things like how to organize a meeting, how to fundraise, how to do public speaking, because women were really not encouraged to speak out in public at this time. And they brought all this to the suffrage movement. Lucretia Mott cited the prohibition of women participating in the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London as part of the reason why they decided to hold a women's rights convention. Another important influence on these early suffragists was the Haudenosaunee Nation located in present-day New York. And on the slide, you can see a map of where the Haudenosaunee Nation was located. So for women who came from European cultures, like the abolitionists I mentioned before, the Haudenosaunee were a model of gender equality. For over 1,000 years, Haudenosaunee women participated in all decision-making processes. They held the power to elect chiefs and handled economic issues within the nation. At the 1848 convention, the attendees signed the Declaration of Sentiments. This was modeled on the Declaration of Independence, and this document outlined a number of issues for the movement for women's rights to focus on, with voting rights for women as one of the most radical. Both men and women attended the convention, including famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. So the focus on suffrage as the main goal of the women's movement came about after the end of the Civil War. Infighting among abolitionists and suffragists who had earlier organized together for universal suffrage for all people started to disagree over the question of whether to support the 15th Amendment as it was written at that time. So at that time, the 15th Amendment would have enfranchised all Black men, but it would not enfranchise women. So those who did not support the 15th Amendment because it didn't include women went on to form the organization called the National Women's Suffrage Association. Those who supported the 15th Amendment as it was written to enfranchise Black men formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. The NWSA was the more radical of these two groups. It engaged in direct action and it organized for a federal suffrage amendment. The AWSA was the more conservative of these two groups, and it fought for suffrage on the state-by-state level. So that means they fought to get a suffrage law passed in each individual state. Because the state-by-state approach followed the states' rights logic that also allowed states to restrict voting rights for Black people, more Black suffragists joined the NWSA. However, most Black women organized for voting rights in their own organizations, like the National Association for Colored Women. In 1899, NWSA and AWSA merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The resulting organization, which is referred to as NASA, became increasingly conservative. It stopped organizing for a federal suffrage amendment, which I'll talk to you about a little bit more when I get to Alice Paul, and essentially only focused on the state-by-state approach. It also allowed individual state branches to exclude Black women, and it supported and to support suffrage for only women who could pass literacy tests, which excluded many immigrants and people of color. So by the time that Alice Paul would join the movement, NASA was the largest suffrage association, but it was losing its momentum and did not have a lot of popular support. So before I tell you about Alice Paul's work in the suffrage movement, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on her. So Alice Paul was born in Mount Laurel, New Jersey in 1885. In the slide here, you can see the house as it would have looked when Alice lived there, still pretty similar to how it looks today. And Alice was born into a Quaker family. So as a Quaker, she had a number of fundamental beliefs that really shaped her work in the suffrage movement. The first one was the idea that all people were born equal. The second was a commitment to nonviolence. And the third was the idea that she should make a difference in the world. So Alice did not immediately get involved in the suffrage movement. She did her undergraduate degree at Swarthmore, where she studied biology. And after that, she moved to New York to study and practice social work. As a social worker in New York, however, she soon started to grow dissatisfied. She was working in a tenement house where many new immigrants were arriving into the city. And she saw that although she could help one family at a time, there were always more people coming in and always people who needed more help. She described social work as putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. So because she was growing dissatisfied with social work, she decided she wanted to move to England and study economics. And this is where her whole life path changed. So while Alice was in England studying economics, she lost out on a fellowship that would have allowed her to continue her studies. At this point, she doesn't know what she's going to do. She can't keep going to school, and she doesn't really know what's next for her. Then one day, while she was in England, Alice attended a suffrage speech by a woman named Christabel Pankhurst. During this speech, Christabel was speaking out in public for women's right to vote, and the crowd that was gathered around was heckling her, trying to stop her from speaking. And when Alice saw this, she just couldn't believe it. She was so appalled that people were jeering Christabel just because she wanted the right to vote. And that is the moment that Alice decided to join the suffrage movement. After the speech, she went up and introduced herself to the Pankhursts, and she started working with their Women's Social and Political Union. So the Women's Social and Political Union was the most radical of the British suffrage organizations. They did a lot of direct action and militant techniques. So things like interrupting meetings, giving soapbox speeches, and smashing windows. And it's this direct action, more militant focused approach to suffrage that Alice would bring back to the United States. After her time in England, Alice returned to the US in 1910, and she soon got involved with the suffrage movement there. Initially, Alice joined NASA because it was the biggest group in the United States, but she had some fundamental differences with them. So the biggest difference she had with NASA was that she wanted to organize for suffrage at the federal level. Alice really believed that we needed a federal amendment to the Constitution to give women voting rights. And like I said earlier, at this time, NASA was really working on the state-by-state approach. Alice supported a federal suffrage amendment because it's much harder to undo an amendment to the Constitution than it is to undo state laws. So to undo a constitutional amendment, basically you have to pass a new constitutional amendment, whereas the state laws could be changed if a new legislature came into power and wanted to change the laws. The second difference that Alice had with NASA was that NASA was very skeptical of the tactics that Alice had learned in England and were worried that her more militant approach to suffrage would turn people away. Because of these differences, Alice eventually left NASA and she formed her own organization called the National Women's Party. The NWP was dedicated to the goal of getting a federal suffrage amendment into the Constitution. And they pursued this with the nonviolent direct action tactics that really helped re-energize the suffrage cause. One of the most radical things that the NWP did was to begin a picket outside of the White House. And something that's really amazing about this is that when they began picketing the White House in 1917, this was the first time in history that anyone had done this. No one before Alice Paul and the NWP had picketed outside of the White House. So the women would stand outside the White House 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, and they were called the Silent Sentinels because they wouldn't speak to anyone. They stood silently and let their signs and banners do the talking. Picketing the White House was particularly controversial in 1917 because that was when the US was entering World War I. And the president, Wilson, at the time, had asked women to put aside all the other issues they were organizing around and really focus on the war effort. But Alice and the NWP knew that they couldn't do that. They said, how could we fight for democracy abroad when we don't have democracy at home? So the women continued to picket through the war, and people were very upset about this. They thought it was unpatriotic to be speaking out against the president while we were at war. Eventually, people were so upset about this that they started to attack the women, trying to rip out their banners, trying to yell at them. And eventually, the women were arrested on the charge of blocking traffic. While the women were in prison, they faced horrible conditions. They were beaten by the guards, they were given dirty clothes. They reportedly had a game where they would count how many bugs were in their food in order to keep morale up. Eventually, because of these horrible conditions and because the women wanted to be treated as political prisoners, they went on hunger strike, and the women were force-fed up to 3 times a day. News of their treatment in the prison eventually leaked, and this really helped change public opinion on suffrage because, many of the women in the NWP were respectable middle-class white women, and it was unbelievable to people in the general public that they would be treated this way. So by the end of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson announced his support for suffrage as a war measure. And in 1919, the Congress passed the 19th Amendment. The amendment was sent to ratification by the states, and in 1920, it was ratified. The last state to ratify the 19th Amendment was Tennessee. And there's kind of a funny story about the ratification in Tennessee. It really came down to one vote by a man named Harry Burns. And Burns was going to vote no initially, but the night before the vote, he got a letter from his mother who said, "Do right by the ladies and vote yes on ratification." And so because of this letter, he did change his vote. So in 1920, the amendment was ratified. The 19th Amendment states that the rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied on the account of sex. On the slide here, you can see Alice. She's up in that balcony at the NWP headquarters celebrating the ratification of the 19th Amendment. However, like I said at the beginning of my presentation, while a lot of histories of women's suffrage will end in 1920, we know that's not the full story. So while the 19th Amendment made it illegal to deny the vote on the basis of sex, states continued to enact laws that barred many women of color from voting for years. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that these discriminatory voting practices were outlawed. Alice herself also didn't see the 19th Amendment as the end of the struggle for women's rights. After the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Alice co-wrote something called the Equal Rights Amendment, the text of which is on the screen. So the Equal Rights Amendment says that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of sex. Alice dedicated the rest of her life to the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, which we still do not have today. So just like I said at the beginning, the fight for voting rights continues to this day, along with the fight for the ERA. So that I'm going to end there. Thank you all for listening, and I will stop my screen share.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. That was a great overview of the history of the suffrage movement and fighting for voting rights. It was very brief, but there's so much that's more to it, and that Olivia could go more in depth. So if you have any questions about what Olivia presented, please put that in the question and answer. So now that we have a background of the historical context of organizing and fighting for the right to vote, we're now going to move ahead into present time and look at when it comes to mobilizing people to vote and barriers that people might currently face when trying to access their right to vote. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker and presenter, Melissa Marks. Melissa is a senior organizer with the League of Women Voters New Jersey. She has a background in environmental advocacy when it came to helping working with Clean Water Action New Jersey, which is able to develop future activists and fight for environmental protections. Currently at the League of Women Voters New Jersey, Melissa works to support members and the public in building strong voter outreach campaigns and advocating for legislation in New Jersey that makes New Jersey a more equitable state. But farther ado, I'd like to bring in Melissa and give you the time to talk about your work and background and what you do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Let me pull my slides up now. So yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Melissa Marks. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior organizer with the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. And that was, a really great lead into kind of what we're doing today. And I want to start by just a little bit of background on who we are. The League of Women Voters of New Jersey encourages informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We're proud to be nonpartisan, so we neither support nor oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government, but we always work on vital issues of concerns to members and the public. So we are a political organization, but we are a nonpartisan organization. And I wanted to start by, centering us in the history that you just heard. Our organization is over 100 years old, and our mission is empowering voters and defending democracy. We were formed right out of the suffragist movement that you just all heard about in 1920. And we were formed as a mighty political experiment with the idea of helping the 20 million newly enfranchised women exercise their rights to vote. So we saw this huge population of new potential voters, and they needed to be educated, empowered, encouraged to participate. And so we were founded back in 1920 and in New Jersey. So that was the whole organization, League of Women Voters of the United States. In New Jersey, we were founded just a few months after the organization was founded, right in Newark. So we've been in this state for over 100 years. I don't think that the founders of the organization expected us to still be working on the same issues, still be, educating voters, reaching disenfranchised voters, and encouraging folks to participate, but we are still doing that same work today. And I do want to add the caveat, of course, that many aspects of the suffragist movement were steeped in racism. And as Olivia really, thoroughly discussed already, historically, we have highlighted white suffragist leaders over many of the amazing leaders of color that played essential roles in the movement. So this is something we always need to consider when we're discussing our history and something that we're still working to reconcile today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about organizing new voters, organizing and encouraging more participation in the election, in voting. And so I wanted to start by having you all think, why might somebody not vote? Whether it's someone talking to you, explaining to you why they're not planning on voting, or what they might be thinking internally, why they might not be planning to vote in any election. And I have a handful of reasons here. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but it's really important to think about why somebody might not vote. And the very first reason I wanted to highlight is because voting requires time and energy. Even just to know what offices are on the ballot, just to know that there's an election coming up, to know when the deadline to register to vote is, or the deadline to vote by mail, or when you can vote during early voting. It requires time and energy just to know all of that, let alone to actually then go and cast your ballot and take the time out of your day. So a lot of folks might not vote just because they don't realize, that there is an election coming up, or they miss the deadline, or they, are too busy and they can't get out the door in time to vote. And so that's not something to shame folks for, right? I'm in this work every day, so I know all the deadlines. I know there are elections coming up in New Jersey. We have elections every single year, but we need to remember that a lot of folks are busy. They have jobs, they have families, they have a lot of different responsibilities. And so it comes down to us to start making sure that we're talking about this. We're reminding folks, we're giving them the tools and the information that they need to participate in elections. And it's not necessarily an individual person's fault if they don't realize or have the info that they need, right? We also want to remember that people may not believe that their vote is effective. And so when you run into that, there's a lot of folks that are voting in an election. And so why does my vote matter? My vote's not going to change anything, right? And this is where we want to empower voters and encourage folks to participate, to make their voice heard. Talking about local elections is a really great way to do that. There are local elections that do come down to 1 vote. They come down to 5 votes. They come down to 10 votes. There's such low turnout in many local elections, but those are the elections that are deciding things that really impact our daily lives, right? So definitely important to consider that. People from marginalized groups might not see good choices. If you look at the list of candidates, the options that you have, and you don't see anyone that reflects who you are, reflects who you identify with, who reflects the issues that you care about, then you're going to be less inclined to, again, put in the time and energy that's required to participate in the election. So making sure that we have representative candidates and good choices for everyone is super important. And then, of course, there are systematic barriers to the ballot that just make it that much harder for folks to participate. And so let's get into what some of those are. Again, this is certainly not an exhaustive list, and these things can happen in New Jersey. They do happen in New Jersey. This isn't just some faraway problem, right? But some things that can be a barrier to a ballot that can impact someone's ability to actually get out there and exercise their right to vote include language access, not having voter registration forms in the language that you are comfortable with, or vote by mail ballots, or all these different things. New Jersey does have some language translations, but it's certainly not everything. Our voter registration deadline, our 21-day deadline, is a barrier to the ballot. If you don't realize the deadline is coming up and you try to register 20 days before an election, that's not good enough. You can't vote in that election. Accessibility issues for voters with disabilities, just getting to the polls or getting your vote by mail ballot, delivered. Just basic accessibility issues can prevent folks from participating. Polling place consolidations and closures. So once we start reducing the number of polling locations that are in a community, we are disenfranchising voters by making polling locations further away or more difficult to get to. We also need to consider where those polling locations are leaving from, right? And historically, that would be communities of color. Disenfranchised communities will have the polling locations taken from those communities, and then the ones that are left are in white communities. Voter roll purges, when we try to clean up our voter rolls, sometimes we might accidentally take off people that are eligible to vote and should still be on those voter rolls. So then they go to vote and they don't appear on the rolls and they can't vote. Gerrymandering, when we do our redistricting, and voter intimidation as well. Having police presence at the polls, for example, can be a form of voter intimidation. So these are just some barriers that people are still facing today when it comes to casting their ballots. So what we like to think about when we're talking about organizing and is messaging. So it can be easy to think about, we need to combat apathy. We need to make sure that people do care. But that's not a super productive way of thinking about approaching these conversations. So instead of focusing on strategies to combat apathy, we want to consider why somebody isn't voting and how we can help that person. So here's an example of what we don't want to do. We don't want to think people just don't care. We need to strategize to overcome apathy. That's not as productive as, for example, people do care about their lives. They care about their neighbors. They care about their communities. Let's think about strategies to use the fact that they care and to help figure out why folks don't vote and how we can help, get rid of some of those barriers, overcome those barriers. So again, try assuming that everyone does care about their community, whether they vote or not, and assume that there are barriers that you may not be able to see, you may not be able to understand. So don't convince somebody, invite them to participate and assist them in participating. People vote when they see that their vote is meaningful, when they have access to good information, and when the act of voting itself is accessible to them. But most importantly, people vote when their neighbors, their friends, and their families are also voting. Voting is social. And so we want to think about building consistent voting habits, directing folks to get information so they feel informed about the candidates. Vote 4 in 1 is our tool for doing that. And then remembering that local elections are important, and we want to focus on building a voting base when we start organizing. And so that's what I'll get into next, organizing to actually get out the vote. So what is organizing? Organizing is leadership that enables people to turn the resources they have into the power they need to make the change that they want. So that's the definition that we typically use when we do our organizing. And we think about people power change. So organizing is getting people or having a group of people creating power for that people that can then make change that they want to see. And leadership is super important, and that's where you all come in, because leadership is essential to organizing. And leadership is accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve purpose in the face of uncertainty. So we need leaders to organize people, create power, and get the change that everyone wants to see. And we can use that when thinking about voter registration and voter outreach. Just to talk about some of the things that the league does, we have about 30 local leagues in New Jersey communities that are organizing, doing voter registration and outreach in their communities. We also have some statewide programs. We have a Reenter Register Vote program, which helps to educate formerly incarcerated citizens, because it's only been a handful of years since New Jersey re-enfranchised those voters. And we need to make sure that we're educating folks, we're encouraging folks, and making sure that they can participate and exercise their right to vote. So we go to parole and probation facilities, we go to some county jails, and we make voting as accessible as possible. We also have partnerships with USCIS, for example, where we go to naturalization ceremonies and we meet new citizens right away. As soon as they are naturalized, we start talking to them about voting, the importance of voting. We get them a voter registration form, and we start building those voting habits early. And we have our Energizing Young Voters program as well, which works with young folks in New Jersey as early as middle school, starting to bring civics education and civics lessons into middle schools and high schools, and building, again, that knowledge, that desire, that reminder that voting and participating in our election systems is so important. Then there's the voter educational component as well. Again, a lot of folks won't vote just because they don't realize that there's a deadline that is coming up, or that there's even an election coming up. So you can do voter education in your community. You can organize town halls or community forums. You can use your local press to get the information out there. And again, reminding everyone that local elections matter. In New Jersey, we have elections every year, and our off-year elections, when we don't have a federal election or a governor, those typically are very low turnout, but they're so important, particularly if your community has an election in April, March, May. The league also holds nonpartisan candidate forums where we invite all candidates to come together and have a forum, so that, again, our residents can feel informed. It's one barrier to voting is not knowing who you want, not knowing who your candidates are, not knowing what they represent, and feeling discouraged for going and casting that ballot. So it's really important to have spaces like this so that we can learn more about our candidates. And we are always looking for partners, not just on candidate forums, but on voter registration, voter education, all of these events. So if these seem like things that are interesting to you, you can definitely reach out to me, reach out to your local league. We would love to partner with more individuals and more groups and organizations as well. And then just quickly wrapping up with Get Out the Vote. There's a lot of different things you can do to get out the vote. And the first thing to do, of course, is to work on following up with the voters that you just registered. So it can be hard, but we definitely want to try to be good data trackers when we're doing our voter registration. There's different things that you can do to track the information, and follow up with that voter. For example, having pledge cards or postcards where folks register with you, then they fill out the postcard with their information, and then you use that to follow up with them later. There's different things you can do, but definitely, you're putting time and energy into registering voters. Try to capitalize on that and encourage them to participate in the next elections too. For Get Out the Vote, there's lit dropping and canvassing, which are super helpful. Canvassing in particularly is high impact, but it is also a big ask for your members. So it depends really on your capacity if you can do that. Text banking and phone banking are on the easier side, text banking in particular for sure, but it does require some money and financial support. So that, depending on what your situation is, may or may not be doable. Postcard reminders are always fun for volunteers, and they are helpful, but they're maybe not as effective as some of these other strategies because you can't have a conversation. And at the end of the day, one-on-one conversations with potential voters is what gets folks to participate. But don't forget about other methods as well. Social media, again, sharing educational resources. We have a bunch that you all can use on our website. And then email, reminding your whole network, hey, there's an election coming up, make sure that you vote. If you are making a voter outreach plan, write it down. Make yourself a campaign plan, because campaign plans don't just live in one person's head. They have to be written down so that you can adjust them later on, because not everything is going to go perfectly. We have a whole campaign plan template that you can totally use if you would like to map out what you plan to do. I just highlighted a couple of aspects of the plan. Your goals, make sure that they're specific, that they're measurable, and that they're achievable. You don't want to set yourself a whole campaign plan that you just can't accomplish, because that's not, it's a waste of your time. So make sure that your goals are achievable, make sure that they're specific, that they're measurable, rather than my goal is to increase voter turnout in all of New Jersey. You want to make it more specific. I want to increase voter turnout among 18 to 20-year-olds in my town, for example. With your targets, the same thing. Make sure you can actually reach those targets, and if not, figure out who you can partner with or how you can, reach your targets. Then once you have your goals and your targets, that will help you with your strategies and tactics that you want to implement. Figure out what resources you have and where the gap is to determine what your needs are. And then make sure that you have a timeline for everything and work backwards. So you might start with election day in your timeline and then work all the way back to today to figure out what you need to do and when you need to do it by. And then don't forget to evaluate your campaign plan. If you do this for the primary, go back through it, evaluate everything, and then you'll be able to make any changes that you need for the general election. And that is all that I have for now.
Thank you, Melissa. It was great for you to hear you talk about the current barriers that people may face when it comes to voting and like the different work that is done to mobilize people to get out the vote, the strategy. I really connected when you said that voting is social, really motivating people with the people in their networks, family and friends, their neighbors, making the issues local so it's more tangible, but also getting people more empowered to get out to vote, education them and stuff as well. Thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing about the League of Women Voters New Jersey and the work that you all do. We have one more speaker who's going to talk about protections under the Division on Civil Rights under the Law Against Discrimination. So our last kind of presenter before we do our panel discussion is Rosemary D. Savino. She serves as the Deputy Director of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights since 2019. Before joining the Division on Civil Rights, she was a senior trial attorney with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where she litigated both systemic and individual claims of discrimination. But thank you for joining us, Rosemary, and I'll give you the floor to talk about protections under our office.
Thank you so much, Kai, and thank you to Olivia and Melissa for your presentations, which were interesting and inspiring. And it's always so interesting and inspiring to learn and to hear about the early suffragette movement, which was, I think, really powerful and I think still carries lessons through to today about disenfranchised groups and what people do to ensure that the thought that you mentioned Alice Paul has and the belief that she has that all people are born equal takes a little bit more work sometimes to get put into action in our day-to-day lives than you might think. And Melissa, thank you for sharing all of the information that's available and all the resources for people and how important it is for people to actually exercise the right to vote that the suffragettes fought so hard for. I want to just talk for a minute about the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights and what the division does and what it's sort of all about. You may know that in New Jersey, we have a law called the Law Against Discrimination, which we call the LAD or LAD. It is the first and earliest state anti-discrimination law in the country, and we're very proud of that fact. It is also historically and currently one of the broadest and strongest anti-discrimination laws in the country. The Division on Civil Rights is the administrative agency that's statutorily charged with enforcing the law against discrimination. And so what that means essentially is that we take complaints of discrimination. So if a person feels that they've been discriminated against either at work, in a place of public accommodation, or in housing, they can file a complaint of discrimination with the division, and we will have one of our well-trained, lovely investigators investigate the claim and determine whether there's probable cause to believe that discrimination has occurred. If we believe discrimination or we find that discrimination is likely to have occurred, we will try to remedy the discriminatory practice or the discriminatory act and seek a remedy for the complainant, and also broad sort of injunctive relief so that we can guard against future violations of the law. We have a community relations group, which meets with stakeholders and is out in the state every day, all over, talking with people and dealing with various issues that come up in the community. We have an education and training unit, and we have our investigative staff that really all together, everybody is just trying to work to make sure that the promise of all people being born and treated equal under the law is really a fact of life in New Jersey. And you can find more information about the Division on Civil Rights on our website. So one of the things that I mentioned is that we have jurisdiction over discrimination claims in places of public accommodation. Polling places are considered a place of public accommodation under the law. So the Division on Civil Rights has jurisdiction over polling places, and that includes access to polling places and voter intimidation and other barriers to voting that may or may not arise. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was that in October of 2022, the Attorney General initiated a project called the Voter Protection Initiative. And that involved very closely the Division on Civil Rights and other groups and agencies all working together to ensure that access to polling places was uninhibited and that there was no voter intimidation at the polls. It is important for people to know that there are structures in place on election day, and that includes all election days. So it can be a presidential election, gubernatorial election, a local election, whatever it is, there are numerous resources available across the state to ensure equal access to voting places, to ensure that, for example, a person with a disability is able to physically go to the polling place and access the voting machine. And when I say that there are resources all over the state, one of the things that happens is that there are literally hundreds of lawyers who are on call and working in the event that there are any problems or issues that arise. And there are phone numbers that are set up for people to call. And these are usually, we publicize this information on the state website, on the Division on Civil Rights website, on the Attorney General's website right before the election, so that if you need to have access to resources in the event of a problem, if there's voter intimidation, if there's a denial of access to a polling place, if you are standing online to vote and the polling place closes and you believe that they're closing early or they're closing when people are still online, we have lawyers all across the state that are on call in the event that an incident or a problem arises. So all of this is to ensure that all persons who are eligible to vote and want to exercise the right to vote on election day, any election day, have full and fair access to polling places at all times. We don't take the right to vote for granted. We cannot take the right to vote for granted. And the Attorney General's office and the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights with the Voter Protection Initiative project is really in place and here to ensure that all citizens have the right to vote. And I'll also mention that in addition to the law against discrimination, we also enforce the New Jersey the New Jersey Civil Rights Act. And that is really where you're sort of constitutionally protected in your right to vote. And that is subsumed within the Attorney General's Voter Protection Initiative. I'm happy to say that there has not been any major problems that we have had to deal with in the election process or access to voting places. There was one issue in a school board election that turned out to be human error in the voting. The Attorney General's office hired counsel to investigate that, and it just turned out to be a mistake that was corrected. And any other issues that arise on election day have been satisfactorily dealt with. But people should know, and you should spread the word that all of these resources are available in the event that there are any barriers to exercising your right to vote on election day. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rosemary, for talking about the Division on Civil Rights, the protections we provide, especially with voting. This is, as we all know, a big election year. So I know a lot of people hopefully will go out to exercise their right to vote and try to go out there. So I think, as you mentioned, it's important to know what your rights are so that there's a case that it is violated, people know what they can do or how they can respond so that they are able to vote and the protections under our agency. So, thank you so much, Rosemary. I'd like to invite all the panelists back on screen. We have a few questions for our group panel discussions before we move on to questions and answers. So if anyone has any questions for any of the panelists throughout this discussion, you can just submit it in the Q&A tab, and we'll have time after this discussion to try to get through on the questions that people ask. But I want to once again, thank all the panelists for coming here and talking about their areas of expertise. It was great to have a background history of the suffrage movement leading on to what we're currently facing when it comes to barriers to voting or accessing the right to vote, and what are our protections in that cases. So to kind of start off with Olivia, hearing you talk about the suffrage movement, I learned a lot because I knew about it, but not all the details. But I saw there's a lot of similarities. We were talking about the way that they fought for the right to vote and the activism. So I guess my questions for you is, what are lessons that we can learn and take away from that movement?
Yeah, thank you, Kai. I mean, I think there's a lot of lessons, but I think one of the most important, especially for our current moment, is just the reminder that all of our struggles are interconnected. This is something I didn't really touch on in depth in my presentation, but like I said, Alice Paul truly believed that the 19th Amendment, the fighting for a federal suffrage amendment, was the way to go. And she really thought that the federal suffrage amendment would grant voting rights to all women. And as you know, we now know with hindsight that that was not true, that there continued to be barriers to voting that particularly impacted Black women and women of color. So this kind of, the lesson there is really this kind of narrow mindset where we can focus on just the issue of gender without thinking about racial barriers, class inequality. So it's just really important to keep in mind how those things are all interconnected.
Thank you, Olivia. And then I guess hop into Melissa. I know you talked about in your PowerPoint a lot of the strategies when it comes to mobilizing people to vote, or even when it comes to organizing in general. I'd love if you can maybe expand on it or talk about what has helped you connect with community members you're reaching out to, or if there's any stories or like your go-to tactic, but like what has helped you connect to community members you're reaching out to?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, my experience personally goes back to my days at Clean Water Action, where as you mentioned, I began my career in advocacy, and I was going door to door and doing the grassroots organizing, canvassing thing. And I had conversations with thousands of New Jersey residents during my time at Clean Water Action. And for me, it's really just listening. introducing yourself, being kind, having a smile, and just listening to them. And so when I talk about in my presentation, figuring out why somebody isn't voting, I mean that, like, listen to what they're saying. Are they saying that they're not voting because they feel that they don't see a candidate that they like? Are they not voting because they don't realize there's an election coming up? Are they not voting because they don't think, voting their vote is going to impact? So really listening to what they're saying and sharing your own personal experiences, right? So rather than saying like, well, I think you should vote because of this, talk about from your perspective. Well, the reason that I vote in every election is I really care about the recycling program in my town. And so that's why I vote for my mayor and my council. Or I have a kid in school, and so I really need to make sure that I'm going to the candidate forums about my school board, and I'm voting in the school board elections, and I'm making an informed decision. So really just being open, having conversations, knowing that you're not going to necessarily convince somebody also in one conversation, right? It's a relationship building, and it's work over time that can get folks to go from maybe not voting all the time to being regular voters, developing those voting habits. So yeah, that's kind of my perspective on it all.
Thank you, Melissa. I think I really resonated when you talked about just listening to people, because I think in a lot of work that we do, a lot of times people just might want to be heard, or they haven't been heard in a long time, or felt like they haven't been heard. So I think as you talked about that goes a long way. It's just like giving people the space to express what their feelings or thoughts were. And as you said, is relationship building over time. And I think something that we learned about from the presentation today, like the suffragist movement, it was a long movement over a period of time. It just happened quickly. So I think kind of similar to the work that you do, it is a work that is done over time, even over generations, but continuing to build that relationship. Kind of shifting to Rosemary, her question for you. So what is the connection between voting rights and civil rights? How are they linked, and why is it so important that they're both in the conversation together?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kai. Thank you. So there are two laws really that I talked about. One is the law against discrimination that applies to places of public accommodation. Sorry, my Zoom just told me it quit. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. The law against discrimination prohibits discrimination in places of public accommodation. And as I said, that includes polling locations. There's also the New Jersey Civil Rights Act, prohibits the basically taking away anybody's rights under any law, including the law against discrimination and including the New Jersey Constitution. So there's a real overlap between those laws. And to Olivia's point about securing the right to vote under the federal Constitution, we have a right to vote under the Constitution, right? So that right cannot be deprived, and the law against discrimination would prohibit discrimination or barriers to access to exercising that right, essentially. So the laws work together and hand in hand, and there's some overlap between them in that way.
Yeah, thank you. And hopping back to Olivia, with the suffrage movement and the overview you gave us, what are some misconceptions about the suffrage movement that people have?
Yeah, this actually goes back to something I think Melissa mentioned earlier, but one of the misconceptions, and I think this has been something that historians have helped to perpetuate just in the way that we single out individual prominent, usually white women, but is that there was actually a lot of diversity within the suffrage movement. And I mean that in a lot of ways, right? Because even if we're talking about the period from 1848 to 1920, that's a long time. So there were a lot of different people working in different geographic areas, people of different races, people of different genders, sexualities, and political orientations. Melissa mentioned that there were many suffragists of color, just to name a few, women like Ida B. Wells, Gertrude Bonin, and Mabel Lee. And also there were many men involved with the suffrage movement, which I think is a misconception people don't understand. There in 1913, Alice Paul organized a women's suffrage march in Washington, D.C., and there was a men's auxiliary that marched in the march. So that's just to say that we often highlight many of the white middle-class women who were suffragists, but there were many different people who were involved and supported the movement.
Yeah, thank you for shining a light on that. 'Cause I think, like you said, oftentimes we don't hear about the diversity of people of color, even men who are in the movement. So it was great for you to highlight that because oftentimes that's lost in history or we don't focus enough on it. I think that's important to bring up and highlight and uplift. And then I guess my next question for Melissa, in your work of organizing and outreach, I'm sure the pandemic has changed or impacted it because there's a shift of like probably things in person or whatnot. But can you talk about maybe how the pandemic, how that might have shifted and changed the way that you do your outreach work and maybe some things that you took away from it now, but really just might have changed the layout or the game that you were doing with outreach work?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, when I was first starting this work, my work was all in person. It was literally knocking on doors, talking to folks, going to, communities and having those in-person conversations. And then when the pandemic hit, I was not at the league in the beginning of the pandemic. I came here in 2021. But, of course, we had to shift our work and it became very virtual, like so many jobs and different, companies and organizations did at that time too. One really awesome thing, that we were involved in, that New Jersey Division of Elections was involved in, was making sure that voters could still vote by having vote by mail ballots, being able to vote by mail without endangering their safety in the pandemic. So that was a huge, victory, a huge change, a huge thing that we were all able to work together on back in 2020. But then since then, our local leagues, we have local leagues all over the state. They shifted from organizing in person largely to really mostly organizing virtually. And there are benefits and negatives to that, right? There really is no replacing that in-person connection when you're able to look someone in the eyes, see who they are, give them a high five, whatever it is. There isn't completely replacing that. And it's really important, I think, now for us to get back to having more in-person organizing and doing more gathering and more getting to know each other and building that community back. But some of the benefits of our virtual organizing is this here today. We can all be in our homes and have this conversation together. We have our training program, which is virtual, and anyone in the state can just hop on or they can review a recording and they can get the education and the information that they need. Our meetings, we can all work together virtually, once a week, once a month, whatever it is, and you don't have to be in a specific place. So it has opened and removed a lot of barriers to participation in a lot of ways, which is great. And we're definitely continuing to do that. But we do want to, try to also get back to that in-person connection and building those communities at the same time.
Thank you. I think as you talked about, I think a lot of work that we do, the pandemic has changed how we connect with people, interact in communities, and we're, I think, always evolving in ways how can we continue to build community and continue the work that we're doing. So thank you for that. And then going to Rosemary, as you talked about how the Division of Civil Rights could be an important resource to file a report or complain if someone's rights has been violated or even when they're trying to vote. But I guess my question for you is, why should someone report to DCR if they face discrimination at the polls or if they face discrimination in general in one of the areas that we apply to, but why should they report to us?
Right. I thank you, Kai. I think
And then, okay, I think you're back with us now, but you're
sorry. How about now?
yeah, you're good.
Sorry. as I said, we have one of the strongest anti-discrimination laws in the statewide anti-discrimination laws in the country. And the right to vote, the right to a job, the right to housing, the right to go to places of public accommodation without discrimination is obviously fundamental and vital. And we need to really exercise our rights and take advantage, if you will, of the fact that we have protections that people have fought very hard for and that we have gotten. A lot of times, and particularly with exercising the right to vote, this is something that we can deal with immediately. Like, you have to be able to vote on election day. And as I mentioned, we have lawyers set up all over the state to be able to ensure that you get to exercise your vote right that day. So that's why I encourage people to look on the DCR website and look on the Attorney General's website before the election so that you know what the resources are in the event that you go to the polling place and encounter some difficulty with exercising your right to vote. The expectation is that we have a law enforcement system set up to make sure that your constitutional right can be exercised at that time.
Thank you. And I have a couple more questions before we go to question and answer. But I have a question for everyone and all the panelists. One of my first question is, part of this program is to uplift the women organizers and activists in general and like elevate that and celebrate it. So I would love if each of you can share a woman leader or activist who inspires you. They can be past or present. Someone who, yeah, just inspires you, you look up to, or like one of your favorites. I don't know if anyone wants to start first.
I can go first. Well, I feel like I would have a different answer to this question every day. But today I am going to say Barbara Ehrenreich, who was a writer and activist, and she passed away in 2022. And something I find really inspiring about her story was that she was someone who turned to history to understand issues that were affecting her, because that's really the approach that I take to my feminism and to a lot of the work we do at API. She said that she really became a feminist because she faced a lot of medical mistreatment when she had her first child. And because of that, she was inspired to really begin to research the history of medical sexism, even though that wasn't her background. So I just, I find that commitment to studying and history and research really vital and really important as a part of activism.
I'm happy to go next since that's our system here. But I'm going to name two people. And one is because, as I shared with you all earlier, I'm a big women's basketball fan, and we're in the women's basketball college tournament, March Madness. So I felt like it was appropriate to highlight one of my basketball heroes, sports heroes, Teresa Witherspoon, who was was one of the first people in the WNBA, one of the first people on the New York Liberty, and is just a really awesome icon and hero for the sport. And then I also want to highlight our former League of Women Voters of the United States president. Unfortunately, she recently passed in January, but Dr. Deborah Turner, who has dedicated her whole life to fighting for, for women's rights, for voting rights, for equal rights, and has been just an amazing leader in the movement. So those are my two folks today.
So I have to say, I'm kind of with Olivia on this a little bit, because my answer to that question, first of all, it's like choosing your favorite child, right? I cannot pick one person, and it does change all the time for me. I think I often just kind of always, my mind goes to Harriet Tubman, and I think about just sort of like, putting your life on the line, and then all of the people along the way who helped people get out of slavery. And I also think of sort of more well-known leaders in the women's rights movement who are always very inspiring and have taught me a lot. There was a woman who used to run first the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, and then the Lesbian and Gay Rights Project at the ACLU, named Nan Hunter, who I learned so much from, and such a smart lawyer, who really early in my career set an example for how you are sort of like an activist lawyer, how you create change through the law. But then in my work in the civil rights space, we meet women every day who don't have any fame and don't have any platform or notoriety in any way, but they are doing the work every day, or women that, walk their children through the desert to get to a better life, women who are holding down 3 jobs so that they can give their kids a better life. So lots and lots of women. And I have to say, Melissa, on the women's sports front, I read something the other day on Caitlin Clark, right? She's like this rock star basketball player now who is breaking all kinds of records. And it literally gave me chills to think about having role models like that for young girls and women. And it makes me think about the women's soccer team who fought for equal pay for so long. And we think about pay inequity, which is also something the Division on Civil Rights has jurisdiction over, by the way. And all these sort of warriors that fight for the rights. And then somebody like Caitlin who comes in and she's just this magnificent athlete and she's breaking all records. And what I saw yesterday was that I thought it said that there were like 50, it broke the viewing record for any kind of sport, like any basketball game, women or men. And I think that has tremendous impact for young girls now, and it's very inspiring.
Absolutely. I'm going to, make it known that I'm a giant nerd, but yes, over 12 million people on average viewed the game on Monday between LSU and Iowa, which was record breaking. It's more than I think it was more than all of the World Series games except maybe one, all of the NBA Finals games except maybe one. It broke so many records, which was very cool. And the role model thing is, Caitlin Clark is definitely an awesome role model, but she had role models too, right? She had people like Teresa Witherspoon and Sue Bird and all these other amazing people that don't get the credit, that they deserve because we didn't have all the eyeballs on that we do now. And so I think that, the whole evolution of women's sports is similar to the evolution of women's suffragist movement. And I think that I'm just very happy for the moment that we're in, and I love it.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. I liked how there's definitely more people I would have researched based on some new names and stuff, but I loved how we even connected it, how there's a lot of unspoken names, that's the right phrasing, but like unspoken voices or words that we don't necessarily know or acknowledge as much, but it is like the everyday person just living their life or navigating it or finding small ways for agency for themselves and to like uplift that as well. I guess I'll share one of my favorites as well, since I asked you all to share. For me, I think one of my favorite activists who I always go back to is Audre Lorde, like scholar and activist and poet and all the things. I really admire her work when it comes to like intersectionality and like revealing it, because the first time I read her work in high school was the first time I felt seen or felt like my experiences were put in words. So that's someone who I always go back to as one of my favorites. But I love kind of like this space of like elevated and uplifting women, past, present, and current, and the work that we do and how we're able to come together and kind of lead the path for the next person. And then kind of shifting gears before we go to question and answers, I guess my last question for all of you. Do you have any last thoughts or statements or things that you might want to leave for the audience before we go to Q&A? Any last thoughts or things you want to elevate or might not have been brought up? Any last words before Q&A?
Yeah, I just to reiterate something I said at the end of my portion of the presentation is that the fight is not over for voting rights. And then another thing that I touched on briefly was the Equal Rights Amendment. And this is something we still advocate for at the Alice Paul Institute. If you want to learn more about the Equal Rights Amendment, I would suggest that you go to equalrightsamendment.org. That is a website that we host that has a lot of information about the history and present of the Equal Rights Amendment. And when you're there, you can sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter all about the ERA.
I love it. I'll also add that the League of Women Voters of the United States is a big proponent of the Equal Rights Amendment. So we're allied on that, and definitely want to encourage folks to look into it and help us, take action on it. But otherwise, I would just say it's awesome that you're all here. And I would encourage you to see what you can do, even if it's a small thing, if it's just one voter registration drive, or it's a whole big, organizing a canvassing in your neighborhood. Whatever you can do makes a difference. And so thank you for being here, and reach out anytime if you want our support or want to chat.
And I would add to that, please vote, and please get everybody that you've ever met to vote and help them to vote. And if anyone encounters any trouble voting, please contact the Division on Civil Rights.
Okay, thank you all. We're going to transition to Q&A. As a reminder, any questions you have, please submit them in a Q&A tab. And then also there will be a survey that will be dropped down for all audience members to respond to and give your feedback on this program today. For starting to Q&A, our first question is, can the presenters share if there is a minimal time commitment or a minimal financial commitment for anyone who would want to actively volunteer their time to keep the movement going? So I guess volunteer with the organizations you're here with today.
I can go first. So yeah, there is no minimal time commitment. There's no minimal, monetary commitment either. We want to meet folks where they're at. So if you can only, volunteer 1 hour a month, that's totally cool. If you want to do more, we have tons of opportunities for you to do more too. So it depends on what you're interested in doing in the voter services space and the advocacy space, locally, statewide. So I'd recommend just starting by reaching out to me, or going to our website and going to our local leagues and reaching out to the local league near you. You can just volunteer. If you do want to become a member, there is a financial component to that. But you can do almost everything as just a volunteer. And we're also in the process of changing our membership so that it's pay what you can, but that won't get implemented for a few more months. But yeah, no minimums for anything.
Yeah, similarly, if you're interested in the work of API and learning what we do, reach out. We have plenty of ways to get involved with our organization or volunteer. And if you're interested in ERA advocacy, any amount of time you can dedicate to that, there's something you can do. Like I said, if you go to equalrightsamendment.org, you can learn about petitions you can sign, all the way to getting involved in other organizations. So there's no minimum. There's lots of ways you can get involved.
Okay, thanks. Our next question is, do any of the organizations also align and work and connect with other states, or is it just in New Jersey?
So for the league, we have League of Women Voters of the United States, and so they work on all of our federal campaigns like the ERA. So if you're looking to get involved in anything nationally, it would be with League of Women Voters of the United States. We have local leagues, or sorry, state leagues in every single state as well. So if you're in another state or you're moving to another state, just look up the local league or the state league, in your state. And we will sometimes, for example, Delaware River Basin Commission, Delaware River Basin is crosses multiple states. So we'll cross over and work with those states when there are, things for us to do and partnering across states.
For us at API, we have a number of different ways that people who are not in New Jersey can get involved if you can't come visit us locally. We do plenty of virtual programs like this that you can book. We can come Zoom into your class or your group, or you can join us for one of the virtual programs we host. We also have a sister history site in Washington, D.C. that I just want to shout out while I'm talking. They are the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. So we are Alice's birthplace, but they are the headquarters of the National Women's Party in DC. So if you find yourself in the DC area, I would highly recommend going to visit.
I'll just add, for New Jersey, obviously we're a New Jersey state government agency, but we do a lot of work with other agencies throughout the country, in addition to a lot of stakeholder groups within the state that have resources in other states as well.
Okay, thank you. And that's all the questions that we have. So I want once again thank our panelists, Olivia, Melissa, and Rosemary. You've shared a wealth of knowledge, starting from the suffrage movement and the tactics that they use, and really diving deep into what was going on. That wasn't just something you just quickly read in the headlines in your history textbook, but the multiple women who was part of it, and the diversity in the movement and the tactics that's used. And Melissa talking about currently how the suffrage movement is links to the current work of the League of Women Voters New Jersey, and how it's still a continued active work and the kind of fight to continue to protect voters' rights and to advance it. That it's something that's ongoing, and something you mentioned earlier was how some of the things you're still advocating for is stuff that was advocating for 100 years ago in the past. So it's an ongoing fight, but I think as we continue in the generations, we continue to build on it so that we're slowly taking down the bricks and getting through the barrier. And then also thank you, Rosemary, for talking about the protections that our agency, the Division on Civil Rights, provides, and informing people about what their rights and protections are, and the important factor of to file a complaint if you do face discrimination, if you're trying to vote, that if you're turned away or if you face an obstacle, you have other avenues. You don't just have to walk away or can't do anything else. You do have other avenues to address it as well, so that we can try to help you in a timely manner, or that it doesn't continue to happen in the future. But once again, thank you to all the panelists for taking your time out and sharing your area of expertise and knowledge. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank my team members at Crew for providing support, Patricia, Angela, and Dave, and Fanny. You guys have been great support in hosting this webinar, and we hope that you all enjoyed it, the audience members. Once again, there is a survey in the chat. Please make sure to fill it out. And thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you guys and you all at future DCR events. Other than that, I hope you guys all have a great rest of the day. Stay dry from all the rain. And I guess this wraps it up. But goodbye, everyone. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.